The empire does not fall with cannon fire. It falls with signatures. In quiet rooms along the Bosphorus, far from battlefields and crowds, men sit at heavy tables under low lamps. Paper is spread flat. Ink flows slowly. Nothing about the moment feels dramatic. There are no marching armies, no collapsing walls, no smoke in the air. Only agreements, loans, guarantees, interest rates hidden in language that feels technical and harmless. In the moment, these documents look like solutions. They promise relief. They promise stability. They promise time. History often remembers the Ottoman Empire collapsing under rebellion, war, and decay, but this story opens with a colder claim. The empire was not first conquered by force. It was weakened by debt, by money it could not refuse, and terms it could not escape. By the 19th century, the world was changing at a speed empires struggled to match. Europe's factories were expanding. Steam engines shortened distances. Trade accelerated. Wealth no longer came only from land and tribute. It flowed through finance, shipping, and industry. To survive in this new system, states needed railways, ports, telegraphs, and modern armies. All of that required capital. The Ottoman Empire had land, people, and strategic geography, but lacked something increasingly essential: liquid cash. Revenues were uneven. Administration was slow. Old systems could not keep pace with new demands. Survival itself began to cost more than the empire could raise on its own. This is where Britain enters the story, not as a conquering army, but as a financier. Britain understood something powerful about the modern world. Control does not always require occupation. It requires leverage. A nation that controls credit can shape decisions without firing a shot. Loans become tools. Debt becomes influence. Think about that. An empire stretching across 3 continents, not collapsing in a single moment, but slowly trading sovereignty for liquidity. Each agreement seems reasonable. Each loan feels temporary. Each signature buys time. And time, when borrowed, always comes due. At first, the transactions feel invisible. Money arrives. Projects begin. Officials speak of reform and modernization. Rail lines promise faster movement of goods and troops. Ports promise stronger trade. Weapons promise security. On paper, the empire is adapting. But beneath the surface, a quiet shift is underway. Debt does not just move money. It moves power. With every loan, obligations accumulate. With every obligation, options narrow. Choices that once belonged solely to the state begin to require approval elsewhere. Not publicly, not immediately, but structurally. The danger of debt is not its size at the beginning. It is its direction. Once money starts flowing inward under foreign terms, influence flows outward. Control slips slowly, almost politely. Interest payments take priority over domestic needs. Revenues once used for governance are redirected towards servicing obligations. The empire remains vast on maps, but its freedom to act shrinks year by year. This is not collapse. It is compression, a tightening of space, a narrowing of futures. Britain does not need to seize territory to benefit. By positioning itself as lender, it gains access to something more valuable: information, oversight, influence over financial decisions. Loans are structured carefully. They are legal. They are documented. They are enforceable. When problems arise, solutions are written into the contracts themselves. Missed payments trigger oversight. Oversight becomes intervention. Intervention becomes control, not through force, but through procedure. The stakes reach far beyond balance sheets. Whoever controls Ottoman finances controls trade routes linking Europe and Asia. They shape access to ports and customs. They influence infrastructure that will outlast governments. And beneath the deserts and provinces of the empire lie resources not yet fully understood, but deeply valuable. Oil has not yet reshaped global power, but geography already hints at its future importance. Financial control today becomes strategic dominance tomorrow. This is why the debt trap matters. It is not about poverty. It is about dependence. The empire does not suddenly become weak. It becomes constrained. It cannot act without considering creditors. It cannot reform without funding. It cannot defend itself without borrowing. Each problem generates another loan. Each loan tightens the web. Think about that. An empire surviving on borrowed money is not free. It is managed. There is no single moment when everything collapses. No dramatic scene where officials realize the game is over. The process is gradual. Balance sheets tighten. Options disappear. Revenues are pledged before they are collected. Decisions are deferred. Authority erodes quietly. Power changes hands without a single battle. This is a trap. It is legal. It is quiet. And once it closes, escape is nearly impossible. This chapter asks the central question that shapes everything that follows. How did a proud empire become financially dependent on a foreign power? And why did that dependence redraw the modern map of the Middle East? The answer is not found in war plans or military defeats. It is found in contracts, currencies, and carefully written terms. The story of the Ottoman Empire's fall does not begin with explosions. It begins with a pen touching paper, and an empire choosing survival today over sovereignty tomorrow. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire appeared unbreakable. Its cities were crowded and alive. Minarets rose above Istanbul's skyline, calling the faithful to prayer while merchants packed the streets below. Caravans moved steadily through Damascus and Baghdad, carrying silk, grain, and spices across continents. Taxes flowed from fertile valleys and busy ports that linked Europe, Asia, and Africa. On maps, the empire still dominated space. On paper, it remained one of the largest political entities on Earth. To outsiders, this looked like endurance. Old, perhaps slower than before, but still commanding, still sovereign, still standing. The illusion held because land still mattered. Territory was visible power. The Sultan's flag flew over strategic choke points of global trade. Control of straits and ports suggested influence. Armies still existed. Bureaucracies still functioned. Ceremonies still projected authority. From a distance, the empire looked stable enough, but power was changing shape. The world was shifting beneath the surface, and the Ottoman system was built for an earlier age. What once sustained empires was no longer enough. Across Europe, factories roared. Machines multiplied output. Coal and steel replaced muscle and tradition. Steamships cut travel times from months to weeks. Railways reshaped economies by connecting resources to markets at unprecedented speed. This was not just technological change. It was structural transformation. Wealth now came from industry, finance, and logistics. States that adapted thrived. States that didn't fall behind, even if their borders remained large. The Ottoman Empire faced a brutal mismatch. Its economy relied heavily on agriculture, manual trade, and traditional taxation. Revenues were slow to collect and unevenly distributed. Administration struggled across vast distances. Corruption drained resources. Meanwhile, military costs rose sharply. Modern armies were expensive. Weapons required factories. Transport required railways. Communication required telegraphs. Each improvement demanded capital. And capital had become global. This is where finance replaced conquest as the primary weapon of influence. Britain had already mastered this shift. It possessed not just factories and ships, but banks, investors, and credit networks that spanned the world. British capital searched constantly for opportunity. Railways, ports, infrastructure, and government loans promised steady returns. The Ottoman Empire, desperate to modernize and stabilize, looked like a perfect candidate. The offers arrived framed as partnership. British money promised progress. Rail lines would unify the empire and boost trade. Ports would increase customs revenue. Reforms would improve administration. The language was reassuring. Development, modernization, stability. On paper, these projects looked like solutions to structural weakness. In reality, they were doorways into dependency. Imagine an empire forced to borrow just to function. Old debts are paid with new loans. New projects generate obligations before they generate revenue. Interest compounds quietly. The strength people see is no longer organic. It is financed, maintained on credit. And credit, while patient, is never forgiving. The illusion of strength persisted because money masked decline. Projects moved forward. Railways were built. Officials spoke of reform. The empire appeared to be catching up. But beneath the surface, financial autonomy was eroding. Each loan came with conditions. Each agreement prioritized repayment. Revenues were increasingly pledged before they were collected. The state began planning budgets around creditors rather than citizens. This is the quiet danger of modernization through debt. It changes incentives. Decisions are no longer made for long-term resilience, but for short-term survival. Investments focus on appeasing lenders rather than strengthening the economy. Flexibility disappears. Choices narrow. And once that process begins, reversing becomes almost impossible. The empire still ruled land, but control over money began drifting elsewhere. Financial decisions increasingly required foreign approval. Revenues from customs and trade became entangled with repayment schedules. Domestic priorities were delayed. Social investment stalled. The empire became reactive rather than strategic. It responded to crises instead of shaping its future. Think about that. A state can look powerful while losing its core nerve system. Territory remains. Flags still fly. But sovereignty is hollowed out from within. Control over money determines control over action. And by the late 19th century, that control was slipping quietly across the Mediterranean into foreign vaults. Britain did not need to issue ultimatums. The structure of debt did the work. When revenues fell short, refinancing was offered. When reform stalled, oversight increased. Each step was logical. Each step was legal. Each step reduced independence further. This is how dependency is built, not through force, but through sequence. To the public, nothing dramatic happened. There was no declaration of financial surrender, no admission of weakness. The empire simply continued borrowing, continued modernizing on borrowed terms, continued projecting confidence. The illusion held because collapse had not yet arrived. But beneath the surface, the foundations were changing. The empire was no longer steering its own economic course. By the time officials sensed a danger, options were limited. Refusing loans meant paralysis. Accepting them meant deeper control. The choice was not between strength and weakness. It was between visible survival and invisible surrender. Again and again, survival won. This chapter is about that illusion, the moment when empire still looked vast and commanding, even as its financial independence quietly dissolved. The moment when modernization became a trap instead of solution. The Ottoman Empire did not fall because it failed to change. It fell because it changed on terms it did not control. When power shifts, it rarely announces itself. It settles in slowly, embedded in systems and agreements. By the time it becomes visible, it is already entrenched. The Ottoman Empire still ruled millions of people, but the engine that sustained that rule was no longer fully its own. Control over money had begun to outweigh control over land. And once that balance tipped, the outcome was only a matter of time. The cracks widened when debt stopped being a tool and became a leash. At first, borrowing had been framed as temporary support, a bridge to modernization and stability. But bridges are meant to be crossed, not lived on. As payments mounted and revenues failed to keep pace, missed obligations triggered clauses that had been written long before anyone expected to read them aloud. The consequences were procedural, not dramatic. Oversight was introduced to protect creditors, then supervision, then control. What followed was not an invasion, but an administrative takeover. Foreign financial commissions arrived under the language of stabilization. Their mandate sounded neutral, even helpful. They were tasked with organizing revenue collection, ensuring repayments, and restoring confidence. In practice, they took command of the empire's most reliable income streams: customs duties, salt taxes, tobacco revenues. These were not marginal funds. They were the lifeblood of state finance. Control was not temporary. It was structural. Once revenues were pledged, they were no longer discretionary. They flowed outward by design. This was a turning point. An empire that could no longer decide how its own money was collected had crossed a line it could not uncross. Budgetary sovereignty vanished quietly. Financial priorities were reordered. Debt service came first. Everything else waited. Soldiers were paid late. Infrastructure stalled. Social investment shrank. Officials found themselves managing scarcity created by obligations they no longer controlled. Britain did not need soldiers in the streets when it could dictate terms through ledgers. Influence moved through accounting offices instead of barracks. Decisions once made in imperial chambers were now shaped by repayment schedules. Even reform became constrained. Changes had to reassure creditors before they could serve citizens. Stability meant predictability for lenders, not resilience for society. Railways built with foreign capital revealed the logic clearly. Their routes did not always serve domestic integration. They served trade flows aligned with external interests. Ports expanded to speed exports. Customs systems were optimized to guarantee revenue extraction. Infrastructure existed, but it was designed to service debt before development. The economy was reorganized around obligation rather than growth. Cause followed effect with brutal precision. Reduced control, limited policy options. Limited options forced further borrowing. Further borrowing deepened external oversight. Each step reinforced the next. It was a closed loop with no exit. Think about that. An empire reduced to administering its own decline, managing systems designed to extract value rather than generate strength. Political crises exposed a weakness. When unrest flared or reform stalled, financial dependence made resistance impossible. Military responses required funding that could not be freely allocated. Administrative changes risked disrupting revenue flows promised to creditors. Even diplomacy became constrained. Negotiating from a position of debt meant negotiating from weakness. The illusion of sovereignty lingered because institutions still existed. Officials still met. Laws were still passed. But the core mechanisms of power had shifted. Control over money determined control over action. And that control was no longer centered where authority officially resided. Decisions that once belonged to the empire were now shaped elsewhere through conditions embedded in agreements. This is how the debt trap worked. It was incremental, legal, framed as rescue. Each intervention appeared reasonable in isolation. Together, they formed a system of dependency that replaced political authority with financial oversight. There was no single moment of realization, no dramatic announcement, only a gradual understanding that the space to maneuver had vanished. By the time the danger became clear, reversing course was impossible. Refusing oversight meant default. Default meant isolation. Isolation meant collapse. Compliance, however costly, seemed like the only rational choice. And so the system persisted, deepening with each crisis. This chapter is about the moment when debt stopped being a means and became an end. When the empire's economy existed primarily to serve its obligations rather than serve its people. When sovereignty became conditional. The trap did not snap shut. It tightened slowly, patiently, until moving itself became impossible. When the empire finally collapsed, it did not fall into a vacuum. Power never leaves space empty. It moves. It settles. It reorganizes. As the Ottoman state unraveled under war, exhaustion, and internal strain, the financial structures built over decades remained firmly in place. Debt had already done the quiet work of shaping outcomes. By the time borders were redrawn, the logic behind those borders was no longer primarily political or cultural. It was economic. Influence followed money. Control followed obligation. The formal end of the empire was dramatic enough. Wars shattered what remained of central authority. Provinces broke away. Armies retreated. Flags came down. But the deeper transformation had already happened. The financial architecture imposed during the empire's final decades outlived the state itself. New administrations inherited systems designed for extraction, not independence. Revenue streams were weak. Institutions were fragile. Economic priorities had been shaped by creditors long before local leaders took office. Borders emerged that reflected strategic interests more than historical continuity. Trade routes mattered. Access to ports mattered. Control of future resources mattered. The map was not drawn to stabilize societies. It was drawn to secure leverage. Britain emerged from the process with influence over key territories and choke points, not through direct rule alone, but through economic alignment. The debt had finished its work. What armies could not permanently hold, finance could quietly shape. New states faced impossible conditions. They were expected to function as sovereign nations while inheriting distorted economies. Tax systems were weak. Infrastructure served external trade patterns. Local industry was underdeveloped. Budgets were constrained from the beginning. Independence arrived, but autonomy did not fully follow. Obligations, agreements, and financial dependencies lingered like ghosts from an empire already gone. This is the aftermath most history books rush past. The story often jumps from imperial collapse to nationalist movements, skipping the economic reality in between. But debt does not vanish when flags change. It embeds itself in institutions. It shapes incentives. It defines limits. For generations, political decisions in the region would be constrained by financial weakness rooted in imperial-era dependency. Think about that. Modern Middle Eastern politics did not begin at independence celebrations. They began in balance sheets written decades earlier. They began with revenue structures designed to serve foreign interests. They began with borders that ignored economic coherence. The instability that followed was not accidental. It was structural. The lesson is uncomfortable because it challenges familiar narratives. Empires are supposed to fall because they're defeated, outdated, or morally exposed. The Ottoman Empire did experience all of those pressures, but its fate was sealed earlier and more quietly. It lost control of its future long before it lost its territory. By the time collapse came, the outcome had already been shaped by contracts signed in calmer times. This story is not only about the past. It is about a method, buying influence without invasion, replacing occupation with obligation, substituting force with finance. It is a strategy that feels modern because it never disappeared. The tools have evolved. The language has softened, but the logic remains the same. Control flows toward those who manage debt, currency, and trade. The Ottoman Empire serves as a warning written in ink instead of blood. Power does not always announce itself with armies. Sometimes it arrives with loans. Sometimes it stays long after flags are lowered. And sometimes by the time its effects are fully understood, it is already embedded too deeply to remove. History remembers battles because they are loud. It forgets balance sheets because they are quiet. But quiet forces often last longer. The empire's collapse reshaped an entire region, not only through war and diplomacy, but through decades of financial dependency that determined what was possible and what was not. If this story changed how you see power, history, in the modern world, subscribe for more cinematic explorations of how money shapes empires. And if you believe these hidden stories matter, share this documentary so others can see how the past still writes the present.